Hello, and welcome again to this episode of What is Carnahan's Hair Doing Today? Also known as Explorations of Christian Thought. It's weird. I mean, I don't even like what's this? What's this? What is this going on back here? What is that? That's weird. The thing up here is weird. I had this flying away the other day during class. I think they're like normal until I get in front of a camera looking at myself, and then apparently I'm Bernie Sanders. If you didn't get that reference, that's fine. You don't need to worry about it. Okay, so comments on chapter 8 for today about theology and philosophy, which in part I've already said some things about theology and philosophy, especially go back to the discussion of culture and how Christianity emerges from the intersection of Jewish and Greco-Roman culture, and in that usually tends to identify itself with the Jewish background, although there's another form of Judaism going in a different direction, and that went along with identifying itself with Revelation. And then on the other side, there is the Greco-Roman culture, which Greco-Roman culture, of course, has multiple different facets. And one of those is philosophy, especially the philosophy of figures like Plato and Aristotle, which had started to turn in the direction of monotheism, a kind of monotheism. And I'm going to talk about more about that today. In the text, it gives you a couple of different models of how philosophy and theology can relate to each other. So talking about philosophy as faith-seeking understanding, or as the handmaiden of theology, or as an opponent of theology, and all of that. Again, as usual, I'm not going to cover the same stuff as is in the reading. I am instead going to focus on what I want to talk about. That's what I do. I focus on what I want to talk about. So the first thing I want to say is that philosophy, the idea of philosophy, is ambiguous because it can mean multiple different things. In one sense, philosophy is a method of a kind of rigorous thought for pursuing a particular set of questions, usually questions that are kind of abstract questions, questions that are second level questions. So if I want to know how to sing, I go to a musician, a kind of musician, a vocalist, right? But if I want to know what singing is, what is the essence of singing, right? Can birds sing? In the same way that humans can sing? Then that's a kind of a question of philosophy. If I want to do science, if I want to do biology, I go and study with a biologist. If I want to know what life is, then I'm asking a question of philosophy. So it's kind of second order questions and a form of rigorous thinking about those. And the method can get specific because it can be about logic, it can be about particular fallacies in thinking, or it can be more general, kind of theorizing about those second order questions. So in some sense, there's a notion of philosophy that is this kind of method that has a set of questions that it's interested in, but no content, right? Similarly, another concept that works similarly is like science. So science, one way to think about science, that is, science is a particular method, the scientific method, which has like thesis, and then you test the thesis. Which is all, you know what the scientific method is. I'm not going to go into that. So it's like a method for doing things. And in theory, again, in science, there's no definitive content. You could find whatever you're going to find out of the method. And so there's no one way to go about this. But in reality, there's also another way to think about both philosophy and science, which is that philosophy and science are particular traditions of answers to the questions that they ask. And that everyone who functions internal to philosophy or internal to science is not actually just deploying a method about a set of abstract questions in a vacuum, but they're doing it internal to a tradition. So if I wanted to study today the phenomenon of objects falling towards the ground, I wouldn't just do that. I wouldn't just start at it and start testing it, right? I would be internal to a set of traditions and theories about why things fall. I could study Newton, I could study Einstein, I could study all of these people that have come before me that have put forward their answers to the question, and I could engage with them to see how good their answers are and whether I want to disagree with them or agree with them. But note that that actually shapes the kinds of studies that I'm doing, right? I don't just come up with them out of nowhere. There's a tradition that I follow. And in fact, it might seem very strange if somebody from outside the tradition comes in. They'd be like, well, why is that the place you're starting at? And the answer is only, well, that's the tradition I'm a part of. I respond to Einstein because Einstein's a really important figure. So philosophy is also a tradition in this sense, that there is an ongoing set of answers to a particular set of questions. And that this tradition usually starts in the West, back with Plato and Aristotle, that they asked a set of basic questions like, what is existence? Pretty big question. What is existence? And gave an answer to that. And what is change? And gave an answer to that. And on with Aristotle, what different kinds of beings exist? And gave answers to that, right? What is time? Gave answers to that. So they kind of started out with these questions and gave a particular set of answers to it. Now, there's another sense of philosophy in which philosophy can be a lifestyle. That was very common in the ancient world, but I'm not going to focus on that because it's not as relevant to what we're talking about in theology in the way that we're talking about. If we were talking about spirituality, if we were talking about piety, that might be more significant. But right now, I just want to focus on the sense in which philosophy is, in the one sense, a method for doing things, and in the other sense, a tradition of answers to those set of questions. And actually, how you relate theology to philosophy depends upon, in part, which one of these you're talking about. So you can have philosophical theology, right? You can have philosophical theology which takes the methods of philosophy, many of the methods of philosophy, that rigorous thinking, the kind of sets of questions that are in philosophy, and imports them to focus on places where philosophy and theology overlap, like questions about ultimate existence, God, etc. And you can have philosophical theology at that point. That looks a lot like any philosophy that's happening anywhere because the method that's used is the same. The only big thing that might be at stake between those two is whether they start from a set of premises that are internal to the Christian tradition. Usually the philosophy starts with a set of questions and presuppositions that are internal to the philosophical tradition, as opposed to, say, the Christian tradition. And there can be questions about revelation, because oftentimes philosophy, especially today, is defined in terms of not starting from any revealed knowledge, but starting from reason or something like that. I actually think that in postmodernity, that doesn't make as much sense anymore, because everybody has to admit that they start from within a particular tradition. So philosophers are starting from within a tradition, and Christian thought, theology, is starting from within a particular tradition, and that's just the way that things are. But that might be a distinction, especially that more atheist philosophers would want to hold, is that philosophy doesn't start from any religious tradition. If we could define what religion, I'm not even going to go into what religion is, because that's way too abstract for what we want to do now. Okay, so philosophy can mean multiple things. So in part in the reading, it looked at using methods of theology to argue about theology. So it gave you arguments for the existence of God, for instance, that have been developed across Christian history. So that's using a method of philosophy in support of a particular kind of theology. What I want to focus on, however, is a different part of the tradition of philosophy. The early tradition of philosophy, which was extremely influential in Christian theology. So a place where the substance of the philosophical tradition influences the substance of the Christian tradition. Very early on, really early on enough that it wasn't something that was debated because it was so much a part of the culture at the beginning. However, as we'll see, there come to be some tensions that emerge from importing this part from Greco-Roman. And again, importing is hard to talk about what's imported, because Christianity is just formed at this time. So it's just kind of at the root of Christian thinking about God is tied up with these Greco-Roman categories. But all that said, and what I'm thinking of here is, in particular, the conception of God that comes from Greek philosophy, from that line of Plato and Aristotle, and down through the Academy after Plato. So these philosophers, they go all the way then to Neoplatonism, really during the patristic period, which is a guy named Plotinus was the most important philosopher of that period. But this is going to be a kind of ideal picture of what God looked like in that tradition. It's not always worked out coherently in this way, but it's really influential in that tradition, and it influences how Christians thought about it and how most people today think about God. So first of all, it's important to say that God, right, or gods, there's a lot of flexibility internal to the term. So if you think about Greek gods, for instance, Greek gods don't have a lot of the qualities that we usually think of or identify with God today. One of the first things that you might think about when you think about God today are the omni qualities. So being all-knowing, being all-powerful, being all-good, and eventually you might think, being perfect seems like it's a quality that God should have. But note that if you look at the Greek gods, they don't have these qualities. I mean, it's oftentimes the Greek gods are playing tricks on each other. They're going around behind each other's backs. And this implies that the Greek gods don't have full knowledge of what's going on. They don't even have necessarily eternal life, right? I mean, like the Greek gods at some times kill each other. Zeus kills his father. So there's times when the gods actually shift off in relation to each other, right? So being a god in the Greek sense seems to imply superior, massive power in comparison to what we have. The potential for something like eternal life, presuming you don't get killed. But not a whole bunch of the other qualities that we have. If we look at the Hebrew scriptures, you don't get an abstract conception of God developed. There is no statement on the omni qualities or perfection of God. There are praises of God for God's power, for God's knowledge, for God's goodness, all of these things are things that God is praised for, and it reiterates that God is in control, that God is on the side of, say, the poor and oppressed, that God is right. So it talks about all of these things, but it doesn't develop it in an abstract way to talk about omnipotence. Also the creation story, really significant in shaping the history of Jewish thought about God. The idea that there was one God that was in charge of creation, as opposed to in the Babylonian creation source where there's multiple gods. So the development of monotheism in Jewish history, although even that is kind of ambiguous, because oftentimes God is pictured not alone, but with a set of other sub-deities like angels, or in the beginning of the book of Job, like Satan sits on a panel that kind of God appeals to and talks to and goes back and forth with for ideas. And we'll see as we go on into the doctrine of God, there's all sorts of questions about how much the Hebrew conception of God fits with this kind of Greek conception of God, and how much the Christian idea of God should fit with the Greek conception of God. But all of that is just to set up the background, to say there's lots of different, when we say God, it's not entirely clear from the beginning what we mean, because that term has had a lot of different meanings throughout history. The ideas that we have about God and that we think of today, the ideas of the omni-qualities, are shaped by the Greek philosophical tradition and how the Greek philosophical tradition thought about God, and that influences the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition afterwards, and the Islamic tradition, and all of those traditions that think in a typically Western way about God and God's existence. So where do we want to start inside that Greek tradition of thinking about God, and how do we want to make sense of that? Okay, so here's what I'm going to suggest, is that we go with the beginning idea of perfection as driving the conception of God. This eventually develops into a whole kind of theology that's called, often called perfect being theology, and is associated especially with a Christian figure, Saint Anselm of Canterbury, during the Middle Ages, medieval period, the beginning of the Scholastic period, when he's drawing on these kind of philosophical ideas. And so perfect being theology starts your thinking about God with the claim God is perfect, and then tries to figure out what else follows from that. So what else can we say about God? If God is perfect, what does that mean about all the other qualities that God has, right? What does it mean about anything else? So perfection, what does it take to be perfect, right? And here, this is the question. So like, for instance, is it more perfect to be open to suffering, or is it more perfect to have it impossible to suffer, right? Would a perfect being suffer ever? Or would a perfect being be close to suffering? How do you make sense of that? Would a perfect being change? Or would a perfect being never change, right? Is change part of perfection, or is it not a part of perfection? Does a perfect being exist in time? Does time move for a perfect being, or is a perfect being outside of time, right? Is a perfect being, can a perfect being have relationships? Or is a perfect being just perfect in a way that they can't actually be related to anything else? Okay. So these are the questions we want to ask. What would it mean to have perfect power, right? What would it mean to have perfect goodness in that case? These are the kind of questions that come up in perfect being theology, and this is a type of theology that I think is deeply rooted in this Greek conception of God. And they came up with a particular set of answers to these questions. So, let's take on the question of change. So existing and changing first, or the question of being versus becoming. In order to become something, you have to change, right? Because you move from being one thing to being another thing, or you shift in your being. So I am right now serious, and then I am right now comical. That's horrible. But I went from one state of being to another state of being, so there was change involved across. So one way to ask about or talk about whether a perfect being would change is to say, is that character of of perfection primarily just a state of being, a being without change, or is it something that would change over time? And here, the classical Greco-Roman answer, which has a lot of influence on Christianity, is that God as perfection is being and is not becoming. Now, why is that? So God doesn't change in this kind of classical Greek framework of thought. Why is that? Well, this is the logic behind it. It is this: if you're perfect, right, and you change, what do you change into? So if something changes about perfection, it couldn't make it more perfect, because perfect is perfection. There's nothing that could make it more perfect. And if you change something and it stays perfect, then there are well, it wasn't really perfect before, right? Perfect means having everything that you need in order to be good, perfect, etc. You're not in need of anything else. You're not. So if God's perfect, then would God change? Because it seems like if you're perfect and you change, you go from being perfect to being imperfect, right? That has to be the change that you undertake. If there is one kind of perfection, there's only perfection and imperfection. Those are the options, right? There's lots of versions of imperfection, but there's only one perfect option. And so if you're perfect and you change, you go from being perfect to being imperfect. And that's a change that God can't undergo. God cannot become imperfect, because by God's nature, God is perfection. Okay, this is the Greco-Roman framework of thinking about God. So, or the Greco-Roman philosophical way of thinking about God. I mean, there's all sorts of popular polytheism and all that. But the philosophical tradition says. So God being perfect actually doesn't become anything. God doesn't change. God is always exactly the same, right? Then, does God experience time, right? Does God experience time at all? Well, if a being doesn't change, then does it experience time? Because to experience time is to live at such and such time. And then, a moment later, to live at a different time, right? And to have times when, like, I wasn't living. And to exist in time is seems like, be related to knowing particular things. So I can know what happened in the past, but I can't know what happened in the future. So again, in this Greek philosophical tradition, there's a tendency to think that God must be outside of time. God must be perfect, and to be perfect, God must be outside of time. God is not internal to time. But what does that mean? How can you think about God outside of time? Like, how does God even observe existence? Or does God observe existence? Does God know? Well, I mean, God has to know, right? God is omniscient, which means God has perfect knowledge. But God can't know in the way that we know. I mean, we know things at particular times, and we know things, only the things that we can know, right? Which are the kinds of things that we know as finite creatures. So God being omniscient, God must know, but God must not know like we know. Maybe God knows all things at once. But what does that mean? What does it mean to say that God knows all things at once? Well, maybe it's like if you went to a movie and you now, by the end of the movie, you like know all of the movie, right? So you hold in your mind the entirety of the movie. Maybe God holds all of time in God's mind like that. Right? So God holds all of the world, all of the movie in God's mind at one time, not at one time because God doesn't exist in time. So, however, not in time, God conceives all things at once, but not at once in time. Is this getting confusing to you? It might, but hopefully you're following along with at least a little bit of the idea that we're getting to. So God's outside of time. God has all knowledge, but has it not across time, all at once, simultaneous knowledge. So God doesn't exist, right? So the question is, like, does God exist right now? And the answer to that's weird, right? Because God exists eternally, but that God doesn't particularly exist, like, in this moment. God exists eternally, and so yeah. And it goes, does God act? Can God do things at particular times? Right? Well, God can't do them at particular times in the sense that we do them in particular times, right? I mean, because we decide to do things in time and we interact with other people and we weren't sure what was going to happen, and so we react to them and like we have this interaction with them. But God, it seems like, can't do that. That's not how God functions in this system of Greek philosophy. As a matter of fact, lots of Greek philosophers had problems talking about God's action at all, because it seemed like it was so abstracted and far away from us. The only act God has is God being, right? So God's action is God being, and God being a particular way, because God's acting can't mean God changing at any particular time. And usually when we think about acting, it means changing. But if God can't change, then God certainly can't act in the same ways that we act, right? And this raises questions about omnipotence. What does it mean to say God is omnipotent? If God doesn't act in the same way we do, then God's power can't be exactly the same kind of power that we have, right? How is it that God influences things? What kind of power can God have? Well, God, I mean, in some sense, might be the ultimate source of everything, right? I mean, that's one way. So there is no power that doesn't have its source in God. That wouldn't require God particularly acting at particular times or making particular decisions, which would require a change in God's mind. So maybe it's just God exists, and God's existence has this effect on other things that brings them into existence. And so nothing exists without God. And maybe that's what we mean by God being all-powerful, is that the existence of all things, maybe the existence of all things is determined by the nature of God, maybe, even. right? So God's existing in a particular way, being perfect, produces another set of things in relation to God's perfection, and maybe it determines everything that goes out from there. So maybe that's what we mean by omnipotence, but not what we mean is not that God like acts at particular times and interacts at particular times, makes decisions, etc. That's not what we're talking about with God, right? Can God suffer? No. I mean, really quickly, in the Greek philosophical system, God cannot suffer. That makes no sense, because to suffer is to be in need of something. I mean, when do you suffer? You suffer when you haven't had enough to eat, right? And so you're hungry. Hunger is a form of suffering, but God doesn't need food. You suffer when your friend leaves or dies, right? Because you depend upon your friend. You're in need of your friend, and that leaves, right? You suffer when you get a cut. You get hurt. Your body falls apart in some way. Well, God, that doesn't affect God. God's in no need of a body or anything like that. So God, being perfect, is not the kind of thing that can suffer. Classical Greek issue of passibility. Self-existence. So this goes back. So certainly one of the things that being omnipotent would mean is that God doesn't depend upon anything else for God's existence, right? And this goes along with the idea of suffering. God doesn't depend upon food. God doesn't depend upon time. God doesn't need anything else in order to exist. God is self-existent. God exists necessarily, and God produces God. There is no cause for God outside of God's existence, right? Incorporeality, bodiliness. So I've already suggested an answer to this. God, if God is perfect, then God can't have a body. That doesn't make sense. In the Greco-Roman thought. And this is because of the nature of bodies, right? So what's the nature of having a body? Bodies are made of material stuff. Golly, that's amazing that I can do that. Bodies are made of material stuff, like little pieces of material, and those little pieces of material are just held together, but they're held together contingently. They can fall apart, and as a matter of fact, over time, bodies do fall apart, right? They're subject to being cut. They're subject to being broken apart. Think about it like a computer, right? So if you get a brand new computer and you have that computer over a period of time, what's going to happen? Well, eventually, it's going to slow down. Pieces of it are going to break. It's going to break down. Same thing happens with any body, right? So this is why ideas and spirit, non-corporeal, non-bodily things are always better than bodily things. Things that have a material form. Take, for instance, what I'm sitting on here, a chair. I'm sitting on a chair, right? But I'm not sitting on an ideal chair. This chair is actually, it's probably, let's see, is it broken in any way? There are lots of these that are broken, but this one's not. So eventually, this will come out. There's a joint here, right? And this will come out of place. And eventually, the legs will break off, and the center will break down the center, and it'll fall apart. And it will cease to be a chair, right? It will move from being a chair to not being a chair. It'll move from being to non-being, which is like the ultimate evidence of imperfection, is that you can move to non-being. Being is great, non-being, not great. So the chair will fall apart. Now, Plato actually develops the idea that ultimately, if the idea of a perfect chair is an idea of a chair that exists in God's mind. And so that idea of a chair exists forever, eternally, in God's mind. And this chair is only a copy of that perfect chair. It's a material copy of it that's kind of like a knockoff. It's not very good. The copies are always worse than the originals. And so the material world that we live in is a kind of knockoff of a spiritual world, a world of ideas that's perfect. So I walk around in a kind of imperfect body that is like going to fall apart. But my soul is in fact perfect, right? The ideal soul, which we talked about, how this idea influenced early Greek eschatology and the idea that there's an eternal soul that's independent of your body. So there's the eternal soul, that's what I am really, eternally, is I'm a soul. But I'm kind of contingently in this body thing that I have to live in. And that gets, occasionally in Greek philosophy, that gets worse, to where the body is like a prison that you have to live in. It's a prison for your soul. It is in fact evil. It's bad. Plato didn't go quite that far, but that's one of the directions that this Greek tradition of thinking can move in, because it thinks that the idea, the spirit is better than the material, which falls apart all of the time, right? So this chair is only a chair in as much as it's a crappy imitation of the idea of a chair. This wall is only a wall in as much as it's an imitation of the idea of a wall someplace. All of these material things that we see are just crappy imitations, and that's why they fall apart over time. Your car is a crappy imitation of the idea of a car in God's mind, and this is why you have to take it in to get it fixed, is because it's an imperfect thing. So corporeality, having a body, is a sign of imperfection, right? This is an idea that's eventually obviously going to cause problems in Christianity, especially with the incarnation. Personality, relationality. So can God have relationships, right? Can God have a relationship with you or with me, or engage on a personal level at any point? Well, God can't depend upon us in any way, right? Because God is self-existent, necessarily existent. God doesn't suffer. God doesn't depend upon our existence. We're we exist as secondary effects of God, right? Because God's being leads to the existence of other things, which includes us, right? But does God particularly care about us? Well, what would it mean to care about us? If it means that God involves God's self in us in a way that leads to the possibility of God suffering, like if bad things happen to us, no, God doesn't care about us. So what could it mean to have a personal relationship? Is God even personal? God doesn't think particular thoughts at particular times. He's not thinking about me now, right? Whatever that would mean for God. God has no now. God presumably knows of our existence because God knows all things simultaneously. But is that a relationship? Because God has known about us eternally, right? God has always known our existence permanently, unalterably, unchangingly. So God doesn't change anything about that existence because God knows it eternally. Can God have a personal relationship or a relationship? This is a question that was a problem even internal to Greek philosophy, because how could God create a contingent changing world if God is not contingent and changing? If God is perfect and so different from the world that we're familiar with, can God actually have any effect on the world? So usually things that affect each other have to have something in common, right? In order for one thing to influence another thing, you have to have something in common. So this piece of plastic, right? In order for me to hold it up, we must both be material objects, right? In order for me to influence the piece of plastic, I have to have something in common with the plastic, which is that we're both material things, right? So what does God have in common with the world as we live in it, which is imperfect? Well, here usually the way the Greek philosophy took care of this problem was they suggested that there's a series of mediating things. So God doesn't directly interact with the world as we know it, because God is really too different from the world. But if we move in a set of small steps from God to the world, so maybe God is being, but God thinks, and so God has ideas, right? And those ideas are ideas that are internal to the mind of God, but aren't just God. They're ideas of God, right? And maybe these ideas that God has, so that they are very similar to God. They're non-corporeal, they're not changing, they're, right, all of these things, they're still in some sense perfect, but they're perfect in particular as opposed to perfect in general. So maybe off of those ideas then there's some idea of, so God has an idea of God's self, right? Self-idea. Well, maybe that is then this secondary thing that kind of is the idea of God that functions like God but is not exactly God, right? And in the tradition of Stoic thinking, they developed this into the logos of God, the reason or plan or word of God. That is the secondary thing that like the first idea of God, that is the idea, God's idea of God, which then is God, right? But is not quite God. Is one step. But then this becomes something in between God. So here's God. Here's the logos, which is the God's idea of God, right? But that thing then can then create other things, right? So then that idea of God can have an idea of itself, and that idea of God can have an idea of God's ideas, right? And then maybe that creates another level of sub-deities that are more like creation, less perfect, right? And eventually you get a whole set of then, there's only one God, only one perfection in God's being, and that being is thinking, and etc. But then there's a set of mediaries between that one perfect God that can't really interact with the world, and a set of things that go on down. And this would have been one of the ways that, say, early Christians could conceive of angels, was as intermediaries, mediating between God and the world, right? So all of these ideas will have profound influences on how Christians think about God. Now, this doesn't mean that Christians entirely take these over wholesale, and at some points there are forms of non-Christian heretical sects that pick up on some of these ideas and push them in ways that eventually Christianity is like, yeah, we can't do that. We can't go there, right? But all the way through Christianity, really even to the present, these conceptions of God all have. Oh, I didn't talk about necessity versus contingency. Okay, does God ever choose to do something? So I think I touched on this a little bit in the past. But say, does God act necessarily, or does God act contingently? Does God have any freedom over how God acts? The classical answer to that is God really doesn't have any freedom, if we mean freedom of the will independent of God's being. God acts in the way that is perfect, and God can only act in the way that's perfect. And so there's no real choices to be made in this process, right? God just is, and God's choices are built into who God is. So there are no choices because all choices that God makes are perfect choices. All perfect choices are, it's already set what's perfect. So God would not choose. God doesn't choose to create other things, for instance. God doesn't choose to create. God doesn't choose whether to think or not and produce those ideas. God doesn't choose to think of God's self and thus to produce the Logos. God doesn't choose to do those things in the sense that we think of them, at least, because thinking is the perfect thing to do, and therefore God does it. Right? God doesn't have an option to do something else because God doesn't have an option to do things that are imperfect. And God's perfect. Right? Makes sense? Right. Okay, so all of that is the Greek conception of God, Greco-Roman philosophical conception of God, that I'm going to refer to from here on out and refer back to many times as we talk about the development of the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, as we talk about the Christian doctrine of God in the next chapter. I'm going to refer back to this like multiple times. I do think this is enough to get us off the ground, however, with the last question that's asked in the chapter, which I want to say something about, which is the question of what do we mean when we say things about God? So Christians have all sorts of statements they want to make about God. God was incarnate. God loves me. God is good. God brought about a particular miracle. God saved my aunt. God, all sorts of things that Christians want to say about God. And the question is, when we say these things, how much are we being literal with them? These words, we understand what these words mean when we say them about human beings, right? So if I say a human being saved my aunt, right? I understand basically what that means. I mean, maybe it was a surgeon who went in and did a procedure and saved your aunt, right? But what does it mean to say that God did something? Do we mean that God acts in some way that's similar to the way that human beings act? Is that implied in the claim, right? Or is it the case that every time I talk about God, I'm really using terms metaphorically or allegorically or something like that? That I'm using them symbolically. So when I say, some of this is clear enough. When I say God is Father, right? God is my Father, I don't mean literally that God is my Father. I don't mean in the sense that we talk about other human beings being fathers to people, that God is my Father. I mean, there's actually a person named Bob who fulfills that function. In my case, I hope not in your case. Pretty sure not. But so there's the meaning of the sentence has to be like, well, I'm using it metaphorically in order to apply it to God. But how much of what we say about God is not said literally? It seems like if the Greek conception of God is true, just about everything we say about God is metaphorical. That God acts. And we could talk about God acting, but basically what we mean is God's being is in a particular kind of way that brings about such conclusions, right? Because God doesn't act like human beings act. We can talk about God knowing, but God doesn't know in the same way that we do. God knows like eternally, atemporally. So what we're talking about there seems to be a kind of metaphor. I have to tell you what is like how we think and what is not like how we think. God's powerful. Is God's power the same? Well, if God's being is God's power, I mean, my being isn't my power. The places that I have power is where I act contingently, right? I mean, I have the power to pick up this pencil, right? Or pen, whatever it is. I have the power, but I have the power to do that contingently, right? I mean, I'm not always picking up the pen. As a matter of fact, my power is the ability to change. Because the ability to pick up this pen is the ability to decide I'm going to pick up the pen and do it, right? At a particular time, in a particular place. Well, God's power, if God is the God of the philosophers, the God of Greek philosophy, it doesn't seem that's what we're talking about when we talk about divine power. God's power would be God's being. So, this raises a lot of questions. And in some senses, right, the more that Christian theology is influenced by this strain of Greek thought, the more they're going to have some problems in making sense of language. And even in terms of the Bible, the more stuff you're going to have to interpret symbolically. We already do that because just about everybody who reads Genesis, where God's walking through the garden, is going to have to say, well, that's a metaphor. Right? God doesn't have a body. Here we're clearly influenced by the Greek tradition here, but at least, even being Christians who sign off on the incarnation, we're not okay with saying that God had a body and was walking around in the Garden of Eden, which is fascinating. Because, in part, we're influenced by this. And so you say, well, that language about God is a metaphor. When it said that God didn't know where Adam and Eve were, well, that's symbolic. It's not literal. It's not actually talking about God. It's a metaphor. God's playing along in some way. So, all of this raises the question of what the relation is between, say, Christian thought about God and this Greek philosophical tradition of thinking about God. So I've raised that as a particular issue in philosophy and theology, picking up philosophy as a tradition and Christianity as a tradition. So we'll come back and we'll address that a little bit further in the next chapter when we talk about doctrine of God.